believes that country for Aboriginal peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships.
The University of Wollongong spreads across many interrelated Aboriginal countries that are bound by their sacred landscape, an intimate relationship with that landscape since creation.
From Sydney to the Southern Highlands to the South Coast. From freshwater to bitter water to salt. From city to urban to rural.
The University of Wollongong acknowledges the custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples of this place and space that has kept alive the relationships between all living things.
The university acknowledges the devastating impact of colonisation on our campus's footprint.
And commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing and education.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name's Martin Keys and I'm from the Advancement and Communications team at the University of Wollongong. Thanks for joining us for this special climate edition of Luminaries. To give us some background, the COP28 Environment Conference is currently being held in Dubai. And this week at UAW, we're featuring a number of scientists and researchers who specialise in climate science. But for this afternoon, we're hearing from three experts who are investigating how people experience and navigate climate anxiety. As the world continues to grapple with the tangible impacts of climate change, eco-anxiety has become a very real problem. In 2021, Google reported a 565% increase in climate anxiety as a search term compared to previous years. High levels of anxiety and constant fear can create physical changes in our bodies. So what is eco-anxiety and how can we support people suffering in this way? How do we create a sense of security and belief that something can be done about the problem? To talk us through this topic of eco-anxiety, I want to welcome our three panelists for this afternoon. Firstly, Natasha Clocker is a critical social geographer with a focus on belonging, marginalisation and discrimination amongst migrant and refugee communities. But for today's topic, she's also a researcher in the field of children's and young people's geographies. She recently led a research project exploring how students confront hope and grief when dealing with challenging subject matter in university classrooms. Associate Professor Clocker works in UAW School of Geography and Sustainable Communities and at the Australian Centre for Culture, Environment, Society and Space. Blanche Valeri is a lecturer in sociology at UOW. Her research investigates how people experience and respond to climate change and how we might do this differently and better. Blanche is the author of Learning to Live with Climate Change, From Anxiety to Transformation, which is available as a free ebook. And we're going to put a link in the chat function of this webinar if you'd like to have a look at Blanche's book. That would be something that you could do during this session. And finally, after 25 years of teaching and supervising on clinical and professional psychology programs at UOW and in the UK, Mark Donovan has recently decided to bite the bullet and complete a PhD while continuing with his part-time training, supervision and clinical practice. In his practice, Mark has noticed the increasing impacts of eco-anxiety in his clients and over the past 30 years, and I'm looking forward to hearing Mark's input today. I'd also like to hear from anyone else who's tuned in. If you have any questions for our panel, if you put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, just click on that Q&A and your little dialogue box will open up. You could address your question to a specific panel member, and we'll try and get through those questions at the end. So I'm just going to start with you, Blanche, and perhaps you can set the scene for us and explain what you would mean by the term eco-anxiety.
Thanks so much, Martin. It's so fantastic to be here with everyone today. So some of the big sort of climate anxiety psychology people define eco-anxiety or climate anxiety as a chronic fear of environmental doom. But as I have a bit of a geography and a sociology background, and we have Natasha here who's a geographer as well, I'll try to offer some sort of complementary perspectives on that. And so the framing of eco-anxiety or climate anxiety often focuses on worries about the future. And so we hear that in that kind of classic definition. But I think there's a lot to gain from looking at related terms and the different temporal and geographical scales that they sort of refer to. So there's also other terms like solastalgia, which was developed by an Australian geographer called Glenn Albrecht, and that was looking at people's sense of the place that they live in degrading around them. So a feeling of homelessness, even though they're still technically in the same GPS coordinates. Similarly, we have fields of research that look at the mental health impacts of climate change. And so that's usually looking at things like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety and depression that follow on after a localized climate disaster. So I think that if we start to connect all of these sorts of phenomena, we can see that when we talk about eco-anxiety, if we use it as an umbrella term to think about worries about the future that are always experienced by people, in particular local places that have particular environmental histories of environmental or climate change, it helps us see it as a bit of a broader phenomenon. And for me, the definition that I work with is a sense that your world is ending, which sounds quite, apocalyptic, but it's not a sense that the world is ending or the universe is ending. But in my experience, really getting into people's experiences in the day-to-day realities of what climate anxiety feels like, it's not just this sort of abstract worry about something that might happen in the future, but closely embedded in people's relationships, particularly for students, worries about the jobs that they might be able to go on and get that might be relevant. It's connected to, the hobbies that they have, the identities that they develop. And so when I talk about a sense that your world is ending, it's really in that lived experience, that the kind of cultural assumptions that you grew up with about what it means to be human, about your place in society, and those sorts of things are being really radically challenged. And so people are having to find a whole new way to live in the world because their world is changing really dramatically.
Thanks, Blanche. So Mark, I think we'll go to you now, and perhaps in your practice, your psychology practice, you've observed this condition of anxiety. Is this something that, can you talk us through what you would observe, and that the people who would come to you with this sort of the anxiety, feelings of anxiety?
Yeah, well, like just coming off the back of what Blanche was saying there, that these, sense of despair, sense of worry, sense of loss, there's a whole bunch of different emotions that people experience when they're exposed to information that says to them, the world's at threat. The world may not be ending, but the world's at threat. And so, what I would have noticed is, an increase at certain points in time, which would be predictable. And obviously, the bushfires, living local to Wollongong, the bushfires of 2019, the beginning of 2020, had, brought people up close to the experience of something that felt pretty apocalyptic. People where the sky is black from the fires and the smoke. It's daytime, but the fire, the world is blacked out. And so this is pretty scary for us as humans. And so, I guess what I experienced then in terms of working with people is the emotional impacts of that. And to me, there's an obvious sort of, the worry speaks to threat. And so there's the threat aspect of like, this is going to come and something bad is going to happen in terms of my future, or even right now, I'm at threat if the world gets hotter and what's going to happen next. But it's the dual thing, because there's also a sense of loss, grief, despair, sadness, anger about, like, why aren't people doing something about this? So it's a whole myriad of different emotions that people are kind of tapping into at different points. Now, I specialize in working with children and young people, and we know that that's a group that both most impacted, but in terms of inheriting the world that is heated up to levels that are dangerous. And also they've got less developed, emotion regulation systems and executive functioning, kind of planning, problem solving systems, which means that they're basically more directly exposed sometimes. And then it depends on the quality of the people around them to help buffer some of those stresses. So, yeah, so I would have seen an increase at times of young people talking explicitly about their fears for the world and what's happening with the climate. Working with, particularly young people, historically for 20 or more years, I would have asked the sort of the magic questions of, if you could have 3 wishes of whatever you'd want. And, like, I was well used to the typical responses of, a better Nintendo game and whatever it was, right? And, but like every time there would be something about the climate, the world. And it's like, wow, gosh, it's sad, like, to hear that young people are so affected that this is the wish that they would have. Like, it's great because they're the future and it's great, but it's also sad that this is what comes to mind for them when they're afforded this sort of 3 wishes scenario. So I think, I don't know, that might be sufficient at this point. I know we'll kind of get to different pieces, but so it's there. It's probably also, maybe the final thing to add is that it's cumulative. And so these things are in the background and they just add up. It's cumulative stress. And so, that it means that then for young people, if they have a disagreement with a friend, that disagreement becomes worse because they're already kind of up to here with all the other things that they're noticing around them. And the grown-ups, obviously, too. It's not just the kids who experience this. Yeah. So everybody, more stress. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, okay. And so, Natasha, if we come to you now, your research focus is very much on the classroom context. How does eco-anxiety affect students studying at university?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. So a couple of years ago, I did a research project with some colleagues from the School of Geography and Sustainable Communities, and we were motivated to try to understand how our teaching of difficult subject matter was impacting students in our subjects. And we were open to exploring emotionally difficult subject matter like child labour, refugee issues, species extinction, climate change. And climate change is what kept coming up as being one that was really a difficult topic for students to grapple with through our teaching. And part of what motivated the work is that existing research tells us that uni students often experience poor mental health compared to the broader population. And that's often linked to things like financial stress. And so we wanted to know how they are affected when, on top of that, they're coming into our classrooms and we're throwing quite distressing information at them through the nature of what we teach. And so we had some focus groups with students and we asked them, first of all, what difficult emotions they do experience when they're in our classrooms, in our human geography classrooms. And I'll just read some of the words they threw at us were that they often feel devastated, depressed, guilty, anxious, helpless, frustrated, horrified, powerless, angry and numb, among many others. I could throw many others at you as well. And they very much felt overwhelmed by the scale of problems like climate change and really helpless when presented with reports that tell us that key tipping points have already passed for what can be done to mitigate climate change. So for them, that was really confronting. And so after we found out how they were feeling in response to the content we teach, we also went on to ask them whether they thought those types of emotions belong in our classrooms, and if so, how we should be teaching them in a way that is not detrimental to student wellbeing. And that's something I'll talk about, but I'll talk about that a bit later. So we can, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Natasha. So Blanche, I think just following on from what Natasha said there, is there something that, how can educators teach in a way that helps students deal with eco-anxiety in the classroom context?
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, Natasha and Mark's contributions there are a great entry point for that. So a couple of years ago, with some of my undergraduate students, we did a survey of environmental educators around Australia, asking them their experiences of teaching young people about climate change and environmental issues, and both what they're witnessing in their students as their responses, but also the teachers themselves, the strategies that they've tried to implement, what they found worked, and the challenges that they faced. And so we sort of ended up coming up with a 4-step framework around what these educators were saying worked for them. And so the first one was around simply like creating space for people to engage with the emotions. So looking at, you know, whether it's coming up with some kind of activity that just helps students take some time to identify what it is that they're feeling and the role that that's playing. So a second one was what we were calling validating or witnessing. And so that's to either, you know, share your own emotional experiences or provide information, whatever it is that normalizes that and makes it clear that that's a reasonable, common, and rational response to what's going on, you know, that you're not alone and that you're not weird for having those feelings. The third one was providing some kind of support around that, that's sort of some of which is, you know, tailored specifically to the emotions, and other that is just support more generally. As Mark said, you know, this is one stress in combination with others. And so providing that support might simply be being a good listener. It might be directing people to, you know, professional counselling services, or finding some other kinds of resources on the internet and those sorts of things. And the final one was what we called Empower, and this was about connecting students to networks or collectives of other people where they could get engaged in taking action that felt meaningful around climate change or environmental issues. And crucially, part of this was the networks and the action. So rather than telling people to go and do something at home by themselves, but connecting them in with other people. And so that really resonated with one of the things I hear a lot is that people feel isolated or lonely in their feelings about climate distress. And I think that's partly because, you know, the legacy of climate denial means that although very few people are actually climate deniers, the kind of meta-narrative of society makes us think that most people are climate deniers and that we're alone in our feelings. But once we start to share those, it's quite surprising just how many people feel similarly. And so that that first one around getting people to engage with their emotions and where it's safe to do so, to share those, is, I think, one of the most powerful things that we can do to just help people feel that you're not alone.
Thanks, Blanche. Mark, I'd like to pick up on something that you said earlier, and you talked about big climate events. So obviously there's two elements to this story. One is the sort of long-term climate change that we would see happening over a longer period of time. But we also have these catastrophic climate events, and I'm talking about obviously bushfires, floods, and drought. And maybe could you just tell us a little bit more about that and what the process is like, what processes happen in our bodies when these events happen, and what does that trigger in our brains, in our bodies?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Martin. Yeah, you know, I guess I was sort of painting a bleak picture before with the bushfires and the dark skies, and so those, and like, you know, then the floods of the following year that came through just our local, you know, within the Illawarra area. So these sorts of events do bring you up close to what's happening now. Like, so that's one thing. If you're directly impacted, or if you're very close to being impacted, then your internal systems that deal with threat, that have, kept us alive as a species on this planet for a good length of time. And, parts of our brains are still the part that we share with reptiles and creatures that have been along this world for a lot longer than us. And so they're the old parts of the brain get triggered in terms of there's a threat and then a mobilization happens, in the space of time between those two claps. So it's real quick that we acknowledge and notice, like you wake up, smoke, and your brain hasn't thought, oh, there's smoke, I wonder what that could be, blah, 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 blah. You wake up in a panic because you've registered smoke, and before your prefrontal thinking brain gets into gear and wakes up too, your heart's beating, you're in a state of panic, right? And so for some people, just even that experience of waking up in panic, like it confirms that something bad is happening. Like, because why else would your body feel like this if it wasn't a bad thing, right? And so what that can then do is just set off panic attacks, further worsening of underlying anxiety to do with other things. And so there's the direct effects that, Martin, in terms of an event can trigger for people specific panic, fight flight responses, which are helpful for dealing with the threats. It's the stuff that keeps the firefighters able to work 72-hour shifts and help everybody in the community and the community to pull together in all sorts of different ways that have happened through COVID, as much as some of these natural disasters. And so good, but in the longer term, of course, you can't sustain that, and it wears us down psychologically, emotionally, physically, in all sorts of different ways. And then we can get into patterns of not sleeping and not relating. We can close down on ourselves in unhelpful ways. Now, so there's those sort of direct effects. And then, of course, there's the 24-hour news cycle and just all the different ways that we consume information these days. And this brain that we've got, it didn't evolve in that environment, right? This is a new trick that our brains are learning about in terms of just the level of exposure we can have to threat messages is off the Richter in terms of that. So at any point, if the news cycle is full of threat message of various forms, and it's important information to let people know about, then that can trigger exactly the same kind of response for people, even if they're not in direct, like at one level, the world is warming up and we all need to do something. Yep. So there is a direct threat for all of us. And yet there isn't an immediate and direct threat in terms of like right this second. I don't need to run. I don't need to fight. But I do need to do some things, and I need my thinking brain in action to do that. And so the point I'm leading to here is that our brains can't tell the difference between something that's real versus imagined. Like, yeah, it's the same mechanisms fire off. And so there's a continual firing of these systems in our brains and bodies where we're getting prepared to deal with a threat, and increasing methods of gaining threat messages. And so that's not a great place to be. And so, I was just really listening with interest to some of the stuff that Blanche was talking about, and we may come back to this in terms of, as a psychologist, what would I be trying to do in the room to help with this? And, it's not far off stuff that Blanche was talking about. But in terms of those big events, I guess it brings it up and personal. You have a real lived experience of just how bad things are, which does change the meaning of when you get then further messages. It's like, yeah, and things are bad. Like, you remember that day I woke up and it was black, or the day we had to evacuate, or the day the floods came through. So yeah, we are directly exposed to this, as well as exposed then on 24-hour news cycles across the world, global. Like, we just got through our fires, and then America had their fires, and then Europe had its fires. And, there's somewhere in the world, there's things happening that trigger us emotionally, and then we just got to find a way of managing and coping, which we may come back to. But just do the stuff Blanche said to me.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, look, so from what Mark has just said there, Natasha, like from a university context, we're encouraging students to think critically about the world and whatever subject it is that they're studying, Do you think educators play a role in protecting students from experiencing difficult emotions in the classroom?
Thanks, Martin. And Mark and Blanche, I really enjoyed listening to what you've had to say. And I have to say a lot of what I'm about to say probably overlaps with what Blanche has found too in particular. And an important finding of the study that I mentioned earlier was that the students were really explicit that they don't want to be shielded from distressing subject matter. And they recognise that it's a really important part of their learning and that you can't teach a subject like human geography, which is what I teach, without going into that terrain. So they recognise it as part and parcel of what needs to be in that space. And they also said that feeling emotionally connected to topics, even if those emotions are difficult ones, is both motivating for them. It excites them to go to class and it makes them remember more of what they've learned. So that emotional connection does help them. And they said they were motivated by their distress, both to do something now within their means now, but also to think about what they could do in their careers in the future to have a bigger impact than maybe what they think they can have while they're students. And I just want to quote from one person, and she said, I think it's important that staff don't change the content to not invoke emotions, because feeling the guilt or the shock, the horror is essential to understanding what the situation is and prompting reaction. And then she said, it's just about managing that. So, and that's part of what we ask them as well is how do we, if we don't need to protect them, we don't need to shield them, that's what they're telling us, what can we do as educators to help them to cope? And this is where there's a fair bit of overlap with what Blanche was saying earlier. And I also have 4 points, which is what Blanche had too. And the first one is very much that being aware of and recognising the emotions that our subject matter might bring out in students and acknowledging this. And one student kind of said, you know, even just say it's okay to cry. If you want to cry in class, cry. Like, this is really distressing content. So go for it. It's normal. Have a cry if that's what you need to do. They did also talk about warnings. So sometimes people refer to trigger warnings, but they were referring in particular to the importance of making sure that people who might have direct lived experience of something are aware that it's coming. So if you're going to be teaching about bushfires, let people know what type of content you're going to be covering so that someone who might have been directly impacted can decide whether it's safe and comfortable for them to stay in that space or if they'd prefer to leave. They also wanted us to build time in to class to reflect and to debrief when difficult things were discussed. And they said quite often, you know, class time's short, teachers move from one thing to the next really quickly, and that we really need to slow that down. So rather than saying, hey, let's, you know, talk, you know, let's, I've just talked about all this difficult stuff and I might have shown you a video that's got something really devastating in it. And then, okay, time to go, class time's up. And they had this feeling of then being thrown back out into the world from the classroom without having had a chance to digest and debrief with people around them. So slowing down and building in time for that intentionally was something they wanted. And then similar to Blanche's last point about empowering, they want not just to be taught about problems, but about solutions. That includes being told about, you know, incredible people in the world who are doing awesome things, trying to grapple with these complex issues, but then also things that they can do potentially now at the more local scale, even if they might feel small, but, you know, helping them to find those opportunities was something that they really wanted and something that would help them to kind of balance the grief and the hope, to get a bit more of the hope back. And I guess, and this is the final point I want to make on this, is that something that I found really, I guess, compelling was that the students certainly didn't put all of the onus on staff. So it wasn't that it's fully your responsibility to manage these emotions. They are very active themselves in terms of figuring out what helps them to manage their emotions. So for some it was faith-based, for some it was journaling, for some it was going out there and joining a club that would let them get involved in various issues. So they were good at that stuff. And then for others, they really brought out the importance of peer support in the classroom. And that was a really, a finding I was really happy to see, because so much teaching had gone online by the time I was working through these interview transcripts. And I thought to myself, how are the students who are studying online and don't get that peer support to help talk them through a difficult lecture or difficult tutorial content, how are they coping with it? They're just sitting alone at home. And one student kind of said during the focus group, you know, when it's at uni, not only can you deal with it with your peers and you can talk through it and you can feel better, but you also get to leave that space. When you're learning at home, you're learning that subject matter, you're by yourself and you're in your home space. So those feelings then, you know, invade that space more than they would when you're learning at uni. So I think that's something that's really important for us to keep in mind. And more students, as we all know, are wanting to come back onto campus, particularly for tutorials. And I think we need to keep in mind that that's a really important part of their coping when it comes to distressing topics.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Natasha. Well, I think I'd like all to just expand this out a little bit to back to you, Mark, and talk about how in the broader community and probably in your work as a practitioner, how do you help and support people in the broader community that are suffering from eco-anxiety, the people who would come and talk to you?
Yeah. Look, at one level, it's the same four things, all right? So it's going to be the same four things because guess what? They're the four things that humans seem to need. And so like from all sorts of different researchers, so from a psychology research perspective, yeah, it's the same four things. And if you look at a program, an intervention program for people who are experiencing eco-anxiety, you'd see these four things that have been described twice. So I'm not going to re-describe them, but maybe I'll kind of take a broader perspective on it. And so, and you know, because you began today talking about how do we kind of revive a sense of security and a belief that, you know, and hope, like, because that's what we need as humans. And so how do you recreate security in a world that doesn't feel so certain, where there's this kind of threat just sort of circling around? And so, yeah, like there is the sort of the processing of emotions that Blanche and Natasha have both spoken of as part of that process. And so now people can do that in all sorts of different ways though. And so there's some fantastic different community-oriented, you know, and non-government organizations that have and activist groups that have established themselves and that provide points of connection. Now, Blanche and Natasha have kind of alluded to both of those, but just to say, I think they're in the chat. And I know that Blanche provided a really good list of organizations where you can just, you know, through just a little click of your mouse, you get land on a website where it's like, oh, okay, this stuff makes sense. And these people are talking about the same emotions that I'm experiencing. Again, that idea of you're not alone. You know, your house might be on fire in terms of that Greta Thunberg quote that often gets thought about, but you're not alone. And so as humans, we're, you know, a social species. And so it's important to not be alone. And isolated means that you're not long for this world if you're isolated. So we do want a sense of connection. So I think, again, at a general level, anybody who's interested in this area would do well to just have a little mosey around some of those websites where there's really very accessible information. And then there's programs. There's like a 10-step program. Good Grief is the organization. I think it's based in the States. So you'd need to do the program States time, which isn't always great in terms of time zones for us over here in Australia. But there's, again, a lot of local organizations as well. Phoenix, Australia provides some really good resources and links for people. So there's those things that have been provided at a general level. And if we kind of shrink it back down, it's like, who are the people that you have contact with? And, you know, I was really interested to hear both Natasha and Blanche talking from their research perspective and what the people that they're talking to are saying, that there's this almost like shame, or that like I shouldn't be having these feelings, like, you know, I'm overreacting, or like, you know, that I should. And of course, it's okay, like, because as a human, you don't get to choose your emotions. Like, that is not a choice you get. You have these emotions. And so a lot of what the work I would be trying to do with people, if, you know, working directly or in group work, would be trying to help people to notice and process, as already described, and find a way to have a meaningful life with these emotions. Not to get rid of the emotions, not to try and manage them so that they disappear or you don't have them, but more just like, yeah. So notice the sense of anxiety. Notice the sense of sadness, of loss. Like when you hear about all the animals that were devastated through the bushfires, and it's just hard information to hear. So notice there's sadness, yeah, and so. And also, in addition to that, what is important in this world at this moment for you, in the world that you live in? Okay, so notice that too, and notice. And so, what is it that you can be doing that takes you in a step towards those things that are important and that you value? And so, and some of those things would be, because as humans, we want to have agency. Like if we haven't got any agency, if we can't act, if we can't do anything, we're in real strife. And people who are very depressed, like, because things have just got worn down, or the loss is too great. And we've probably all experienced times when our mood's been lower and we've got that sense of what it feels like to feel very sad, and it's just everything's effortful. And you've lost all agency. Like, it's really, everything is very hard. And so we know that if we get to that spot, that, you know, people like myself, psychologists, what we're trying to help people with is like, okay, so what are the things that bring you a sense of connection, a sense of achievement, a sense of enjoyment? Okay, and so what are the little things that you could do for the next few days and this week that might be on that list? And so let's make a list of some of those things that you could maybe just start to do a little bit more. And slowly we creep back to, again, having a sense of achievement from doing things. It's important. And connection to the stuff that matters, and then also a sense of joy and enjoyment. Like, and some of that could be through taking part in some of these activist groups, because they could bring all three. But it could also be having a game of tennis, or playing bridge with your friends, or, you know, and I think it's sort of come up, but maybe just to also emphasize connecting with nature. That's generally on the list of what can really help with eco-anxiety, is to connect with the nature that is there. Because, yeah, there's all this threat and devastation and sadness, but hey, there's also this amazing environment that is still here. Like there is still this here. This is also here. And so being able to reconnect with that can really help reinvigorate a sense of hope for people. And then with that, you know, a bit more agency and drive to continue on and do stuff that's meaningful for them. Yeah. So
thanks, Mark. Yeah, look, that's really helpful. And I think I love the way that both Mark and Natasha have really come to us today with some real positive steps and solutions about how we address the way we're feeling and cope with things that we may experience from time to time. I guess, Blanche, perhaps back to you. You could, is there, beyond helping people manage climate anxiety, are there other broader things to consider in how we make sense of and respond to ecological distress?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. And I know there's a question in the chat already, and also a request for the link, so we'll get to those in a bit. Yeah, so I guess I think that obviously helping people in the short term and the long term, just on an individual level emotionally, is really important. But what I'm hoping, you know, that we can start to do as a society, as this becomes more of an issue, is to ask kind of sociological questions around, what do these high rates of eco-anxiety, for example, I think one survey of young people around the world found that 75% said they think the future is frightening. So this is not a not a niche issue. If we have this is such a pervasive issue, what is that doing to us as a society, and why is it happening from a social perspective? And what are some of the broader social changes that we need to implement in order to address that? And so some of them are sort of the obvious things that fix all kinds of issues, like reduce inequality, allow people more time in their lives, like Natasha said, to have classes where we actually have time to sit with people and dwell through difficult things, treat the environment better generally. Like addressing these things at the root causes is really important. And we can come up with really well-informed, really well-practiced, developed techniques to support people in that kind of late stage, hard end of climate anxiety. But, at best, they're a Band-Aid, and that we need to be thinking really more systemically about actually, changing the system, as our youth climate activists say, because unless we're doing that, we're never going to address eco-anxiety. And so I think it's really important that we also think about the politics of who gets to have a say around controlling narratives around climate change and how that affects the way that people respond. So I guess there's some great critical analysis out there around, that we'll get frustrated at people that have come to be labelled doomers, the ones that say, oh, there's no point doing anything, nothing's going to save us, we're all doomed. And the ways that fossil fuel companies and other sorts of fossil fuel lobbyists really fuel that kind of narrative, because once people feel, as Mark said, that they have no agency, that there's nothing that they can do about it, that really plays into the hands of the fossil fuel industry. And so when we see that our emotions are, they're not unnatural, they're not wrong, but they are also socially constructed through some really pretty powerful players in the world, and we can start to see I don't want to say that we're being manipulated to feel particular ways, but I think we need to be critical of the multiple factors that play into this, and equally how, our feelings of feeling like maybe we're the weird one who feels this way is also a really dominant discourse that's pushed by people in the fossil fuel industry. I've started calling it greenhouse gaslighting, building on, the feminist analyses of gaslighting as a tool used to make people feel that they don't know their own reality, that they're going insane, and particularly how that's feminized as being hysterical and irrational. And so we see, whether it's criticisms of school climate strikers or dismissals of climate disaster survivors as, just feeling raw or, not knowing what they're talking about or having needless anxiety, these kinds of things, that's, again, like a political structure that affects how we can experience our emotions and also how we can respond. And so these structures of greenhouse gaslighting are, I think, sort of set by, political leaders and fossil fuel lobbyists, but we also see them playing out and perpetuated in, I think, what is sort of the equivalent of microaggressions. So in that same survey that found really high rates of climate anxiety among young people, I found that 50% of young people who've tried to speak to an adult about their concerns has been dismissed. And that probably takes the form of being told, don't worry, things will be fine. Someone else will look after it. You're just a kid, don't worry about it. It might not be a hostile dismissal, but, these kinds of little patterns all the way through society that tell us we're not going to talk about that. Don't bring that up, and those sorts of things. So as much as I think there's really important work to be done on the really practical stuff of helping people, I also really want us to start to expand the conversation to hold power holders to account for the ways that they perpetuate and create, these emotional harms that are particularly intense for young people.
Thanks, Blanche. I will go to the first question, a question from Jenny, and I'll point it to you first, Mark, but it probably would be good to get a response from Blanche and Natasha as well. Jenny asks, as a person, I see a lot of people my age deciding not to have children due to the anxiety they have about the future of the planet. What's your advice to people who may have lost hope for the long term and have adjusted their plans as such? That's a pretty fundamental question about the future of humanity, Mark. So no pressure here, but what do you think about it?
So thank you, Jenny, because it does strike to the heart of what's it all about. Like, it's that sort of sense that gets described of existential dread is very much soaked in your question of why have children, and I've seen that I've seen research talk to what you're describing in terms of that there are many people who are making a conscious choice to on the basis of the world as they perceive it and not wanting to bring children into that world. And I guess at other points in history, I'm figuring that there would have been other things that people would have made other conscious choices of in terms of making maybe similar sort of decisions around times of world wars and what have you, and what is ahead. And I grew up in a family where my father was absolutely convinced that there would be nuclear annihilation. What was the point? And so that was my my dinner table chat. So to your question then, what to do about that? In some ways it would be, again, these things that have already been spoken about, and particularly by Blanche, in terms of to sort of be present with those emotions and to notice them, not too shy. And I can hear that people do want to avoid, as Blanche is saying, it's too hard. And so if a kid says something, the parent is like, oh, not that, dear, I've got no space for that. And so I think that's a normal human response. Sometimes if things are overwhelming, we pull away. And so what can you do? You can notice that this is a feeling and that there's some thoughts attached to it of like, what's the point? And should you bring children in? And to just be with those. And then I suppose, as described before, to think, well, what is important for me? And what's the contribution I want to make to this world? Like, what's my life about, I guess, is what you're asking. And for some people, having children is such a key part of what their life's about, that's really important, no matter how bad the world seems, that me raising the next generation and that's going to be my contribution. And so, but for other people, that's less important. And there's people who make that decision without a fear for the future. And I know of my 4 children, one of them is thinking similarly about, in terms of not having children on the basis of the world that she perceives. And so, so it's right here at home for me. So I just think for all of us, the best we can do is really to be aware of what we're experiencing, but to try and look out and notice, and then try and connect with whatever is important to us, and then head in that direction. So it's a classic psychologist's answer, Jenny. I apologize for that aspect because I haven't really answered your question at all, but I did talk for a period of time.
Thanks, Mark. Natasha, did you have something to contribute to Jenny's question there, or Blanche even?
Yeah, and I really hope it doesn't come across as glib or dismissive. When I hear that, I hear it a lot, it does make me worry. And the reason it makes me worry is because we live in a democracy and who we have voting really matters. So I always think the people who care enough to consider not having children because of climate change are the people who would raise children, who would A, vote for people who are going to do more about climate change, and B, raising that next generation who care and will just be really good citizens of the world. So that's kind of my immediate reaction is, but we need people like that to have kids for the future of the work that needs to be done, and the future of who gets voted into positions of power. So yeah, I hope that doesn't come across as dismissive, but that's always my first thought when I hear that concern.
No, I think that's a really valuable answer, Natasha. I thank you for that response, because that's a really healthy way of looking at Jenny's question. Blanche, do you have anything to add on this question at all?
Yeah,
we've sort of covered it, yeah.
And thank you, Jenny. It's such a huge thing, so I probably have too many thoughts. But as the question is specifically around what advice would you give, I think to respond to that bit, in my experience, one of the things that I found my students find the least helpful is when people try to pressure them to feel hopeful. And so for me, the best thing is to ask people how they feel and why they're feeling that, and to accept that, and rather than to try to coerce them to feel a particular way. And I think that's a really important, like, democratic practice, to respect that people have an entitlement to decide how they feel and how they respond to things. And I think it's also worth noting that, like, I think in these conversations we get quite obsessed with hope as though it's some kind of silver bullet, but it's like, hope is exhausting, actually, because hope is not optimism. Optimism is this, like, belief that things will be good, but hope is sitting with the uncertainty and finding reasons to feel positive about it. And when we're talking about something as huge as planetary change, to show up and perform feeling hopeful every day is actually really exhausting. So I think it's important that we don't put pressure on people to appear hopeful. And I think the appearance and the performance of feeling hopeful is quite different to actually living in a hopeful way. And then questions around reproduction are really difficult, because they're loaded with so much around gender politics and, you know, pressure from parents and other life, you know, cost of living, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole lot of things going on there. And it's a very live question for me, as I'm sort of in that age group where this is, like, very much a thing for my friends. And as someone whose has friends who've made that decision that they won't have children, I think it's really interesting to see how people have always been judged whether they do or don't have children, and how those conversations of judgment of other people's reproductive decisions is changing, but still perpetuated in some ways. So I think it's important that we always respect people's decisions. And so as a feminist, I've been trying to, I guess, come up with, like, how would you justify this when I feel, you know, very genuinely like I understand why people wouldn't want to have children. And I think one of the examples I find that is inspiring is thinking about people who've lived through what felt like the end of their world in the past, whether that's, you know, First Nations people here in Australia, or, you know, anyone who's lived through some kind of colonization or genocide in the past, that although for people like me who are, you know, white middle-class settlers, where most things are going pretty well, except, you know, planetary breakdown, this feels like a new issue, but people have been through comparably similar phenomena in the past, and they've found reasons, you know, to keep going as a society, and as a culture. And I think there's some kind of perspective we have to take there that, you know, the science is really great, but we also don't know how society is going to respond, and the future is not locked in. And I think there's always reasons for hope, even if they're not apparent. So anyway, that's a bunch of rambled thoughts.
No, that's good. I think the message that I'm getting from all three of you is that there is hope message is something that we all need to hang on to. And our colleagues that are doing the climate scientists on the ground, getting their hands dirty, are part of what that solution to looking at what has happened in the climate in the past to help us predict what we should be doing in the future. And that's the value of us all working together and hanging on to that hope is how we will move forward as a community. The other thing that I think, just linking into the demographics thing, is perhaps, Mark, does someone's age affect their level of anxiety about climate change? Are older people generally less worried compared to the younger people that you would see in your practice?
So yeah, I think it's well documented that younger people are more impacted. And, I mentioned before about that the less well-developed, emotion regulation and executive function systems that help adults over 25-year-olds to kind of see it in perspective, try and maintain a perspective, a helpful perspective, a hopeful perspective. Whereas for a younger person, you can kind of just get lost in it. And also this is your friends. This is all that, all the different connectivity around you is saying things are bad, things are bad, things are bad. And so I think younger people, their dose of the doom can be higher for various reasons, and they're less able to be able to draw back and see the bigger picture. Yeah, and it's interesting. So listening to what Blanche was saying there a second ago, and just that sort of the hope, trying to maintain the hope. And something that I know it's interesting that cropped in my head, like an image in my head as you were describing that, was walking through blackened forests, in the weeks and months after those terrible bushfires, and there's all the green shoots. Yeah, and so it's like, yeah, even in this apocalyptic, and there really was an apocalyptic landscape, little hope just triggers up again. And so there is a little part of human resilience that, and that is important. We want to hold on to that resilience and the green shoots of our own sort of optimism and hopefulness. And it does appear, like as you were saying, Blanche, that like there's people who've lived through terrible things and yet maintained a will to keep going somehow. So,
Mark, I might just quickly try and get to one more question from Ian, and I'll address this to Natasha. It's from Ian, who says, the surveys I'm seeing is that over 60% of young people feel very worried or extremely worried. And Ian says he recently asked some new cadets that are first or second year uni if they were worried about climate change, and he was surprised to find that it was not a real concern for them. So did your research, did your own research, Natasha, on the remaining 40% shed any light on the thoughts that they had about, I'm not sure whether your research specifically looked at what people aren't worried about, but is that something you can quickly talk to? We have about 2 minutes left.
Probably not to a great degree, because my research was qualitative, so we didn't have those kind of statistics to draw on, but there was nobody in the group who said they weren't worried about climate change. So I can't really get to that. I think, Blanche, you earlier cited some studies. Would any of those give insight, or?
My quick response would be, I think it's a very ideological thing, and I'm not sure, Ian, you've mentioned cadets, so I don't know what particular degree they're in, but we know that students from particular backgrounds go into particular degrees, and so it could be the case that the social norms among that group mean that even if you do actually feel that way, that you don't feel comfortable to say that in front of others. It could be that the young people you're working with come from a particular demographic or a particular kind of political culture that means that actually they don't experience that. Yeah.
Thanks, Blanche. Look, thanks again, Mark, Natasha, and Blanche for sharing your insight and your knowledge with us today. I think the "there is hope" message is what we take away at this point. And that's important for everyone moving forward. This event was recorded today, as all Luminaries events are, and I always get to the end of a Luminaries session going, I know more now than I did when I started this session. So for anyone watching today, if you know anyone who might be interested in watching this recording, please feel free to share that. The Luminary series is a great piece of work that happens out of our UAW research here. And I think there's some valuable insight that has all been shared today through our panel of experts. So Blanche, Natasha and Mark, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge with us. And thanks for joining us for Luminaries 2023.